A very good morning and welcome to the 24th meeting of the Criminal Justice Committee in 2025. We have apologies this morning from Pauline Neal. Fulton McGregor is joining us online and Sharon Dowie is slightly delayed in her arrival. So, before I start, I'd like to extend our congratulations to our colleague Ben McPherson MSP on his new ministerial role and thank him for all his work in committee. And I'd also like to welcome Jamie Hepburn MSP to the committee. We look forward to working with him and ask him if he has any relevant interests he wishes to declare.
Thank you. I think the only interest that I would declare that might be relevant to the working committee is that I'm a member of Amnesty International.
That's great. Thank you very much. That's noted. So our next item of business this morning is to continue our inquiry into the harm caused by substance use in Scottish prisons. So today's session gives us the opportunity to take evidence from the Scottish Government. And I'm very pleased to welcome the following witnesses: Angela Constance, Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs; Marie Todd, Minister for Drugs and Alcohol Policy and Sport; James McClellan, Deputy Director, Community Justice Division; David Doris, Prisons Policy Team Leader, Criminal Justice Division; Richard Fogel, Director of Population Health; and Alison Crockett, Whole Systems Unit, Drugs Policy Division at the Scottish Government. So you're all very welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. And I refer members to papers 1 and 2. And I intend to allow up to 90 minutes for this session. So I now invite the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister to make a short opening statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Good morning, Convener, and thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before committee this morning. And I would like to thank committee for accommodating my request to move this session from last Wednesday due to the stage 3 of the Victims, Witness and Justice Reform Bill. That is much appreciated. I very much welcome committee's inquiry into drugs and prison, which recognises the significance, the harmful impact and the dynamic nature of issues relating to illegal drug and substance supply in prisons. And this includes concerns about the rise in strength of synthetic drugs, the impact on people in prison and, of course, prison staff, and the importance of access to effective rehabilitation and support, which I am aware that you've taken evidence on. As the committee is aware, there is a high and complex prison population, and issues relating to preventing supply, keeping people safe and managing the impact of substance use in prisons is demanding for the Scottish Prison Service, to say the very least, but also our NHS colleagues and other partners. And I would like to put on record my thanks to the hard work and dedication of the staff in these organisations to keeping people in our care and their colleagues safe. The health and well-being of those in the care of the Scottish Prison Service is a key priority, and having been Minister for Drugs Policy and now Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs, I have a strong appreciation of the importance of a strategic approach across health and justice. I know the committee are interested in how health and justice portfolios are coordinating to reduce deaths and support recovery, and how lived experience and evidence are being embedded in strategy. As you may be aware, I chair a cross-portfolio ministerial group on prisoner health and social care, which provides clear leadership and helps ensure a joined-up strategic approach to health and social care within prisons. The Vision for Justice provides an overarching strategic approach, including the focus on person-centred approaches to reduce crime and harm in our communities and supporting rehabilitation by the most effective means possible. And our national mission to reduce drug deaths continues to focus on a public health approach to improve the treatment and care provided for those with drug issues. The Scottish Prison Service 10-year drug and alcohol strategy, which was published in February, sets out a framework for improving outcomes of those in custody. I'm sure there will be a range of issues, Convener, that you will want to ask about in more detail. Looking forward to committee's questions. But first, I would like to hand over to Ms Todd.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ms Constance. And I'd like to also thank the committee for the opportunity to be here today. I'd like to take the opportunity to say a few words about the progress that's being made in providing appropriate and timely treatment to those in the prison estate with drug or alcohol issues. But it is important to acknowledge at the outset the recent drug and alcohol-related death figures. Far too many lives continue to be lost to substance misuse, and that has to remain at the forefront of our response. We know that around 2/5 of those in prison self-report problematic substance use prior to imprisonment. Prison should therefore be somewhere where substance use is dealt with both sensitively and effectively. And on that point, the MAT Implementation Support Team are working to deliver a programme of support for justice and custodial settings. The standards reinforce a rights-based approach for people and the treatment they should expect, regardless of circumstances or where they are. In terms of recovery work, we provide funding to the Scottish Recovery Consortium to embed a person-centred recovery-focused approach benefiting prisoners, families and staff. This continues into the transition and resettlement back into the community. As I'm sure members know, we've expanded access to naloxone to all prisons, and we're funding the Scottish Drugs Forum to deliver peer-to-peer naloxone supply within the estate. We've also made funding available to the prison to rehab pathway that enables suitable and motivated individuals to access residential rehabilitation immediately on release from prison. And providing support to those with drug or alcohol issues is not distinct from providing them with other health care. As a government, we've supported the National Prison Care Network to develop a target operating model for healthcare delivery in prisons. This sets out a nationally consistent service model for the delivery of the range of clinical services provided in prisons, including drug and alcohol services. Despite the very challenging operating environment, I'm encouraged to see steady progress in the number of services that have been implemented across the prison estate. I'd also like to highlight that the period of our national mission, the period that our national mission covers, will conclude next year, but we're currently developing a refreshed alcohol and drug strategic plan to continue the important work to address both alcohol and drug-related challenges that Scotland faces, and I expect the plan to publish early next year. Hopefully, I've given the committee a flavour of the activity taking place, but I look forward to taking questions on anything I've said or any other issue relating to this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Minister. I wonder if I can start off. I'm going to stick with the Minister, and it was helpful to hear your update with regard to the specific matter of healthcare in prisons. And as you'll imagine, we've taken quite a bit of evidence with regard to support in the healthcare space that is available in prisons. And of course, there are challenges with that at the moment by virtue of the prison population, not least of all. So we have heard, as I say, we've heard from NHS and Health and Care Partnership representatives that prison health care can often be limited by operational constraints. So Dr Craig Sayers from NHS Forth Valley, during his evidence, he noted that although he's present from 8 AM to 5 PM, sort of on weekdays, he can only sometimes see prisoners during sort of relatively short windows, just due to officer availability and the kind of natural constraints that can emerge in the prison estate. What he told us was that in some prisons, however, there seems to be more flexible access, which he believes would be something that we would look to become more standard. And this would obviously let NHS staff see more patients and provide better care. So I'm just wondering if you'd care to respond to that. Perhaps what commitment can the Scottish Government give to engaging with the prison service, NHS Scotland, on how, I suppose, a more effective model perhaps could be embedded in prisons, just building on the important service that is there already?
Certainly. So I'll bring in Richard to tell you a little bit more about how we're approaching this. And the Cabinet Secretary mentioned the ministerial cross-portfolio group that we have in prison healthcare. The Scottish Government's worked very closely with SPS and with the NHS to develop a target operating model for service delivery. There are undoubtedly constraints both in the prison system and in the healthcare system. So, within health there are also staff shortages and workforce challenges in terms of recruitment to the prison estate to recruit the entire full multidisciplinary team. And the full multidisciplinary team is required. We are, all of us on this in this room today understand well the complex multimorbidity. So there are lots of the people who are in prisons tend to have more illnesses and be older than their years generally. So there are lots of health challenges in that population. I'll hand over to Richard to explain more about how we've come up with the target operating model and how we're working to embed it into the prison estate. It is a complex challenge.
Good morning. Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. So I think as you heard last week, including colleagues NHS from Forth Valley, there is a question of consistency, and that's why we've established a series of both oversight and improvement support in place, both ministerial and in relation to the Scottish Healthcare and Custody Network, that's looking at the question of consistency. So exactly at the moment what you have now is really for the first time a systematic look at that emerging practice and the ability for us to be able to flex across the prison estate to try and make sure that that best practice is implemented. So that does not now rely on individual establishments to take the initiative. What you have now are experts coming together, like Dr. Sayers, to make sure that that practice is identified. So the target operating model, I think you heard last week, I think one colleague mentioned the fact that potentially looking at Norway and other jurisdictions, whether that's a good model. This allows us the opportunity to find that best practice appropriate to Scotland and to apply it. So that is the target operating model. We have a 3-year implementation phase for that. We're about halfway through. We're seeing that probably about 70% implemented. About 12 of the 30 change recommendations within the target operating model are relevant to alcohol and drugs. And I think some of the key issues for us that the target operating model is trying to address would be workforce. So again, for the first time, we have a full audit of the entire clinical workforce working on prisoner healthcare, including on mental health and on alcohol and drugs. And that's allowing us to identify from a national perspective where the vacancies are. So if that flexibility that Dr. Sayers is talking about is limited by workforce, we're able to take a national approach to that to potentially support Forth Valley. The other barrier that the target operating model is trying to address would be the underlying data and clinical system infrastructure. And again, we've significantly invested in that from a national perspective because, as you might understand, the actual limitations, including the systems that operate in primary care, the GPIT model itself is being updated. So the situation within prisons is a distinctive one, but we're trying to address both flexibility in the workforce and ensure that the infrastructure is there to support the delivery of this target operating model.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary.
And forgive me, Convener, just to briefly add to that, of fundamental importance to me, particularly as the chair of the cross-government ministerial group, is to really knit together that collaboration between our National Health Service and the work that the Scottish Prison Service facilitates. Committee will have heard me say before that irrespective of where a citizen is residing, whether that's in the community or custody, that the equivalency of service and support in healthcare is imperative. Now, there are obvious changes and demands in and around delivering services within the context of safe and secure prisons. But in terms of that collaborative work, what is being rolled out now is an improved healthcare referrals process. There is a revised memorandum of understanding between the Prison Service and the National Health Service. And crucially, and I think this is important in terms of that multi-agency working that Ms Todd referred to, is that there is now more joint training taking place between the prison service and the NHS. And I can't, it may sound like a technical point in terms of a target operating model, but I can't for a minute underestimate the importance of that in terms of getting consistency and delivery of healthcare to our prisoners at a national level.
Thank you for that. So just by way of a follow-up, it's very helpful to understand a bit about the target operating model, because I don't think that's something that's been raised in evidence so far. So it's good to understand that approach is being used in terms of promoting service delivery. I don't want to complicate things, but how does that tie in, or does that tie in with the MAT standards and how they're being sort of rolled out across the prison estate?
Yeah, again, Richard can come in on this, but yes, they do. The addictions were identified as one of the key themes in the target operating model. So yes, the implementation and embedment of MAT standards is a key part of ensuring that it works effectively within the system.
I mean, it might be helpful to the committee in terms of your evidence gathering for us to provide you with a specific briefing on the delivery of the target operating model. There are multiple work streams. It may give you some comfort. The issues that are of concern are being addressed, and we can certainly follow up, convener, to make sure that you've got that information to hand. I mean, absolutely, the target operating model is looking to the future, to that consistent multi-agency approach, and actually our ambitions for MAT are part of that. So they are absolutely designed to be complementary. So we would expect the target operating model to be delivered at a point which would allow us to deliver on the MAT standards commitment.
Yeah, thank you. I think that would be really helpful, just to sort of get our heads around how everything sort of intersects together. So thank you for that offer. OK, I'm going to bring in Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Cabinet Secretary, this committee has heard a great deal of evidence that the single biggest influence on substance misuse in prisons is overcrowding. And that's due to things like reduced resources, staff capacity, or time spent in cells. Now, the Cabinet Secretary will have seen Theresa Medhurst just today in The Scotsman saying that the overcrowding means that prisons are simmering on the brink of a crisis, and pointing out that the early release schemes have failed to address overcrowding. So, Cabinet Secretary, what actions is the government going to take to address overcrowding? When will those actions deliver a genuine reduction in numbers? And will the government be trying another early release scheme?
Thank you, Convener, and thank you to Mr Kerr. He is quite correct to point to the impact of significant overcrowding and the impact of that on prisoners and staff and access to drug treatment, but also to other forms of rehabilitation, and overcrowding puts the system under immense stress. And I would be the last person in this room, and I suspect the last person in this Parliament, to ever demur from the serious and significant challenge that we face in terms of a prison population that I have said on a number of occasions is too high, and that our prison population needs to be sustainable, because ultimately that's what keeps our communities safe, and our prisons need to be able to accommodate those who pose the greatest risk. If I can also respectfully remind the member that on more than one occasion, every time I have taken action, I have reminded Parliament that there is no one solution to this. Early emergency release provides temporary relief. The Prisoners' Bill, in terms of the STP 40 programme, reduces the prison population in a sustained way, but from 5% from what it would otherwise be. And if I could just perhaps quote Ms Medhurst when she said, "I am grateful for the leadership and support we have received from the Cabinet Secretary and colleagues in the Scottish Government. Were it not for the Emergency Early Release Programme last year and the Prisoners' Early Release Scotland Act, which came into effect earlier this year, our situation would be far worse." Now, I accept that that in itself is not good enough. So I do want to reassure committee that I am intensively engaged with the Scottish Prison Service. I have always proactively kept Parliament up to date, and that won't change. Should new measures be required, those will be announced in Parliament, as I have always done. I would, of course, perhaps, maybe a little bit cheeky of me, Mr Kerr, while I haven't walked away from my obligations to take action, I think other members in this Parliament have often balked at those actions. I would suggest, perhaps for political expediency, as opposed to prioritising the safety and security of prison staff and managing a very high and complex prison population.
I'm grateful. Let me throw that back to you then, Cabinet Secretary. Which new measures precisely are you proposing then? And I fear you may have avoided the question that I paid off with there, which was, will there be another early release programme?
So actually, Mr Kerr, I did answer your question when I said I was intensively engaged with the Scottish Prison Service. That engagement will be built upon in terms of engagement with trade unions and also victim support organisations and other justice partners. And as I have always done, if further measures are necessary, I will return to Parliament and communicate that to Parliament as a whole and explain, as I've always done, any action that I believe is required and why that action is necessary at any point in time.
I'll move on, although just as a remark, because I think we'd all accept that there is overcrowding, and I was simply trying to establish what is being done to bring that overcrowding down. I certainly don't question the engagement the Cabinet Secretary has. But I think people outside need to see real change. But
they do, Mr Kerr, and I hope you'll hang on to that thought, particularly when the Sentencing and Penal Commission reports later on in the year.
So, looking at outside, you mentioned rightly drug treatment earlier on, and looking at the numbers of people entering prison in the first place, this committee's heard evidence of the low level of community payback orders which have drug, alcohol and mental health treatment requirements. And, of course, we've seen data that shows lower levels of drug treatment and testing orders being imposed than pre-COVID. Cabinet Secretary, why is that, in your view? And is the Edinburgh Bar Association correct to say that in Edinburgh a DTTO, which was an alternative to custody, hasn't been available since 2023? And what's the government proposing to do instead?
So there's a lot in that question, Mr Kerr, and I hope convener will bear with me. In terms of community payback order, I think the latest figures would show that there's been in excess of 15,000 across Scotland that have been issued. Drug testing and treatment orders, and just let me stress, I am very supportive of drug testing and treatment orders where they are appropriate to an individual. So the latest figures show that 23-24 there's 280 drug testing and treatment orders. So they are, by their very nature, a much more discreet intervention, obviously involving the courts. They do vary in terms of how they're implemented across the country, so that has presented some challenges in and around getting a real firm view of their effectiveness. I have certainly visited drug courts that are monitoring drug testing and treatment orders and know that for many individuals they have been very successful in helping people turn their lives around. They are, like all community justice interventions, they're delivered locally. So I am very aware of the decision that Edinburgh Services took and also the impact that that had on East and Mid Lothian. I would stress that these are local decisions. They are effective for many people. I think completion rate for a DTO would be around 51%, with 75% finishing without any breach. As I said, the evidence around DTTOs is a bit complex. In terms of community payback orders, the great strength of a community payback order is it can be tailored to the individual. And one of the things that the Sentencing and Penal Commission is looking at is not just how custody is used, but how community disposals are used, because it is an interesting question why there's a comparatively low proportion of additional conditions put on a community payback order that are very specific to drug and alcohol treatment and mental health. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's right or wrong, because sometimes we forget to look at treatment and support in a much broader context. So treating someone's addiction could actually be better treating their trauma. Employability, support with life skills, support with daily living, addressing, some of the specifics around offending behaviour and the attitudes that might underlie that, as well as treatment of mental health and addiction issues. So it is difficult to, I think, at this point, see whether that is, a good or a bad thing, and I think we need to, understand that more. But the strength of a community payback order is that it can be tailor-made to the needs of an individual.
I'm very grateful, and I wonder if I might ask if, after this, perhaps the Cabinet Secretary or officials can send the committee data by sheriffdom on the use of DTTOs, so that we can see if Edinburgh is an outlier or what's happening across the country.
I think Edinburgh is an outlier, but we'll send information, and that may be something that Ms Todd's team can help with as well. But we'll be more than happy to do that.
I think the committee would be very grateful. Thank you for that. Final question from me again. I'll stay with you, Cabinet Secretary. This committee's heard evidence that there are simply not the required resources in terms of prison officers, NHS staff, and what they need to address this issue within prisons themselves. The impact of this committee has heard on those working in our prisons is physically, mentally and emotionally exhausting. And again, I know the Cabinet Secretary has seen Theresa Medhurst's comments in Scotsman today on that note. So, Cabinet Secretary, what is the Scottish Government doing practically to ensure that there is sufficient funding available to provide the resources required? And do Theresa's warnings have any influence on the Cabinet Secretary's thinking as regards the upcoming budget?
Of course you do, always. Let me specifically address the point of budget and Scottish Government actions, but I do want to firstly put on record again that I recognise that prison officers and indeed other prison service staff and NHS colleagues in the context of our institutions do a very difficult and at times dangerous job. In terms of the budget, this financial year there was a 10% uplift for the Scottish Prison Service, and that followed on from the previous financial year a near 10% uplift. We are investing nearly £500 million in our prison service. Prison officer numbers have increased. Today they sit at 3,797. And I'm kind of conscious that resource is more than top level of financial investment. It also speaks to how we use our resources. There are two other points I would wish to make. One is, I'm sure committee seen that we successfully reached a 2-year pay deal for Scottish prison officers, and that was on a par with Agenda for Change, and I was very pleased to secure that, and I hope that speaks to my commitment to prison staff, and also to argue the case for them, internally within budget process. And my final point, and I say this, and I'm conscious you asked about Scottish Government action, but I'm going to make this point because I think our trade union colleagues would be quite miffed if I didn't make this point, and that is the Prison Officers Association 68 is too late campaign. Prison officers can't retire to their 68, and I find that incredible. I find it horrifying. As many of you will know, a few decades ago, I was a prison social worker. I could not imagine being a prison-based social worker at 68, never mind a prison officer. So, there is work to be done there. Obviously, that's at a UK level because there was a complete omission of the unique position of prison officers when the Hutton Pension Review. And I just put that on record, convener, because I think the Prison Officers Association would wish me to make that point.
Very grateful. Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to bring in Rona Mackay in a second, but I wonder if I can completely change the line of questioning. So in terms of how drugs, how substances are coming into prisons, we've heard a lot about the different ways that they're entering prisons, and obviously one of the main ones is currently use of drones. So just a quick question to ask if either the Cabinet Secretary or the Minister is able to just update committee with regard to communication with the UK Government on extending the no-fly zone regulations for prisons that are currently in place in England and Wales. But I think, as I understand it, there's been some ongoing work to look at how that can be extended to Scotland.
I'm happy to do that, convener. And let me start by being fair and balanced. When I found out about these regulations that apply to England and Wales, I was a wee bit miffed that Scotland had been treated as a wee bit of an afterthought, because obviously aviation and civil aviation and air navigation and all the rest of it are reserved. Nonetheless, engagement between my officials and UK Government officials has been very constructive. We are essentially asking the Ministry of Justice to be a sponsor in terms of making a recommendation to the Civil Aviation Authority. I do also want to say that this is one tool of many. I don't want to say that if these regulations applied to Scotland, that everything would be solved or job done. It would help the drones and the drone activity, and the impact they have is exceptionally concerning. But I'm also aware that in terms of the supply of illicit drugs in prison, it constantly evolves. So you're constantly having to reappraise those tactical and operational approaches. But this would definitely help, and to be positive thus far at official level, engagement has been positive, and I've also taken the opportunity to write to the new Lord Chancellor, Secretary of State, Justice David Lammy, to of course welcome him to his new role, but also to raise this issue as well.
So, and I suppose just following on, I mean, is there any idea of timescales on this? Because obviously it's something that's come up, and timely resolution would be good.
Well, that's a fair point on timely resolution. That's why I took the opportunity to write to the new Secretary of State of Justice for England and Wales. I don't know if officials have any insight as a result of your engagements, David?
I would say nothing specific at the minute. We're engaging with UK colleagues. There is an amendment being made to the regulations, so we're examining whether or not there might be an opportunity to piggyback on that, or if it might just need to be via other regulations. Our understanding was, though, it was a fairly unusual procedure that was used down south, so we're kind of investigating how that was actually came about and how we can most efficiently support UK colleagues progressing that. But it does need technical information from SPS around sites, locations, distances from prisons, you know, almost like the geo-mapping type thing. And you also need to consider exemptions. So there's a few things to be bottomed out, and the Civil Aviation Authority have got a lot of expertise and experience around that. So it would be a wee bit of a joint project to sort of work through that. But we've still to kind of get a commitment from, well, not so much a commitment, a clear sense of the timescales, because clearly MOJ and other colleagues, they've got existing priorities and commitments and things as well. So we'll need to just sort of identify what could be the most efficient way to do this. But we want it to be done as soon as practicable.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to bring in Rona Mackay.
Oh, thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister, Cabinet Secretary. I want to ask about through care and release, but before I do that, I wonder if I could ask the Minister about something that came up at last week's session, which was kind of news, certainly news to me, and I think most of the committee. It's about a drug called Buvidal, which is apparently seen as a kind of wonder drug for stabilising people for a few days, but it's not. It's quite patchy in its use. It's not available widely. Just wondered if you could expand on why that is. Is it to do with cost or availability, or?
So I think Buvidal is available and should be available all over Scotland. The Scottish Medicines Consortium have assessed it and have given recommendations on where it should be used and how it should be used. It's, I mean, you have to indulge me, I'm a pharmacist as well as a government minister, so it is somewhat of a wonder drug. So it's a little bit different from other opioid substitution therapies in that it's a mixed agonist-antagonist. So that means it has some built-in protection against overdose inherent within the drug. And that's really important for the prison population, given the recognised risk of overdose immediately after liberation from prison. It also is because of the nature of a long-acting injection, so the generic name is buprenorphine long-acting injection, Buvidal is the brand name. That means that it's given by injection at intervals. It reduces the need for the individual to present daily at a chemist shop, which can be quite degrading. Some people find that a supportive intervention, some people find it degrading, and it interferes with their getting on with rehabilitation and resuming caring duties or work or employment or volunteering or whatever else they may be needing to do on liberation from custody. The fact that it's a long-acting injection does mean that it is impossible to divert. So that is another advantage. Again, I wouldn't call it a wonder drug, but when you're making your decisions around what is the best choice of opioid substitution therapy, given globally the evidence is very strongly in favour of opioid substitution therapy, it reduces deaths, it reduces harm, it reduces criminality, it helps people to recover and stabilise. That inability to divert it is a real advantage. So if we think the last time we had, detailed data about our drugs deaths, about what was in 2020 is the last time we had this very detailed interrogation of the drugs death data. And what we found was that 53% of people who died had methadone in their system. 40% of those individuals who died after taking methadone were not prescribed it. So there is a level of diversion within the system which is dangerous, which is contributing to drugs deaths. So that's another reason why long-acting buprenorphine, which cannot be diverted because it's injected into the patient, is an advantage over other forms of opioid substitution. Of course, the MAP standards, we are very clear. Individuals who are receiving the medication, who are accessing healthcare, should be very much a part of the decision-making process around which drug is right for them.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Because I was going to ask, is this the kind of new methadone? But you've explained the difference there. But can I ask a couple of other questions on it? Which is, so who actually prescribes this, and why is it not more widely available? Is it due to cost?
So there are cost implications. And we can write to you with what the SMC said when they assessed its role in therapy. I don't think they said it was first line across the board. What they said was that it was a very suitable alternative for those for whom methadone was not the appropriate drug. There are cost implications, but as always with these things, you have to balance the drug acquisition cost with the economic value. And there's work going on to try to understand the differences between how much advantage you get from methadone versus how much advantage you get from long-acting.
Many outcomes, really.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work. I mean, the Scottish Drugs Forum did some peer studying of long-acting buprenorphine recently, and one of the things that they talked about was that it tends to make people more alert and awake. So again, if we go back to that, it's a mixed agonist-antagonist. It's got some blocking as well as some direct action on the receptors. And what that means is that people are more alert. Some people really struggle with that. So that was picked up in that peer review work, was that people who, I suppose if you describe it as have been anaesthetising themselves to life for a very long time, suddenly being aware of their circumstances can be very difficult for them, and they need support through that staged intensive psychological support. So if we go back to your question around the economics, having a drug which people are more alert on has obvious implications for working, caring, resuming your role in society. So there will be significant differences. There are also significant differences in the amount of health professional time that's required for either prescription. So a methadone prescription generally requires to be frequently written, frequently reviewed, and there is a cost to supervision within the community. The costs for a long-acting injection are less, but there may be more costs in terms of the psychological support that's required, but then you might get significantly better outcomes. All of that is being examined at the moment, and there is a keenness to understand across the UK. So last week when I met with the UK ministers, there's a great deal of keenness to understand that rich information and to try to give recommendations. In Scotland and Wales, Buvidal is reasonably widely used. And again, we can get you the statistics if neither of my officials can provide you with them. It is reasonably widely used. It is significantly less frequently used in England, and English colleagues were advocating that it should be more widely used because it clearly has a role and some advantages over the alternatives. In terms of how it works in Scotland, I have heard anecdotally that there are concerns with different health boards around the arrangements for prescribing long-acting buprenorphine on discharge, on liberation from custody. But my concern would be, and government's concern would be, that drugs, prescriptions should not be changed for bureaucratic reasons or administrative reasons on discharge from prison. Discharge from prison is a recognised high-risk period, and changes to medication during that period should happen for clinical, personal reasons agreed between the individual and the clinician prescribing for them, and the risks of that period around liberation should be well and truly acknowledged.
Thank you. Thank you. That explanation was really helpful. Thanks very much. If I could just go on to talk about through care and release for the minute. And, Minister, you said in your opening statement, you talked about treatment plans for prisoners on liberation, etc. I wonder if you could maybe just say something about the numbers needing to access that, and if the service is there for them, or is there are there people slipping through the net or not able to access, is really what I'm saying.
So certainly, I think Alison may be able to give you more detailed information, but certainly what we are seeing is a lot of effort going on for third sector organisations, recovery communities to reach into prisons, and for a lot of work to be done around the transition to support people as they are liberated from custody. And we are seeing in our data that this really high-risk period that is well recognised on liberation, that we are seeing fewer drugs deaths in that period than we have done previously. So the work that we are doing is having some impact. I don't know, Alison, if you have...
Yes, just looking for my numbers, but we have been, we give the Scottish Recovery Consortium about £630,000 a year to run recovery cafes in a number of prisons in Scotland. And essentially what that's about is really trying to acknowledge that this is a difficult time, that for many people they're in that going around being released from prison, very quickly relapsing and going back in again. And so what this is about is actually working with people whilst they're still in prison, identifying who their support networks are when they get out, linking them into recovery networks on the outside, so that it's the day they are released, they're already connected to another organisation where they can continue to get that support, trying to interrupt that cycle of in and out that so many people experience. So Scottish Recovery Consortium have been expanding that this year. I've got them in a note somewhere, but I'm not going to rustle through whilst you're waiting. Can certainly provide you with those specific prisons.
Helpful, thank you. Thanks very much indeed. That's really helpful. And just finally, possibly the Cabinet Secretary could answer the bail and release from custody bill in 2023, which most of us here would have been working on, had the issues of housing and lack of medication in the community and all the through care things that we want. Some of it has still to be implemented, and so maybe that will be a booster when it's fully up and running. I wonder if you could bring us up to speed with what's happening there.
Yes, so progress has been made with the implementation of the bail and release bill. So if you recall that part one was the new bail test, and that has been implemented from May this year. You may recall that there was a Section 102 order required from the UK Government, and that was to make sure that our bail test didn't inadvertently have consequences for extradition procedures. So part one fully implemented, and that also, if you recall, enabled justice social work to proactively contribute to bail decisions if they had information, and obviously the court can make requests of justice social work. Parts of Part 2 have been implemented. If you recall at the passage of the bill, and in particular Stage 3, where there were amendments to lengthen the time between commencement and publishing of the national through care standards, and that was because of an acknowledgement of the amount of work that needs to be done in that. So Section 12, if you recall, is the release planning duty, and we are looking at a space for commencement of that. And the release planning duty, if you recall, is about putting an obligation on named partners, quite a lengthy list of partners in terms of local authority, health boards, Police Scotland, and how they have to comply with any request from the Scottish Prison Service to engage in the development, management and delivery of a release plan. Some of this work has actually happened in practice through the STP 40 programme and earlier release programmes. So there has been, in some ways, a bit of a trial run, but we will be, looking to certainly bring forward commencement plans on Part 12. Section 13 was with regards to the national through care standards. And as I said, at the time of the bill's passage, we made clear that there would be a 2-year period between commencement and publishing those standards. So we are engaged in the work with partners, obviously liaising with SGLD in terms of timeframe for commencement. And there's 2 phases of this. And if you recall that the commitment was for these standards to be, co-produced by partners, but also to have public consultation. So again, there is a lengthy list of partners that Scottish ministers must engage with, and that actually includes the voluntary sector as well, which is very positive. There's particular research that is being undertaken and that will have to be brought to conclusion as well. And then phase 2 is for that full 12-week public consultation. So the clock will start ticking when we bring forward the commencement order.
I think it's very encouraging that all these things are taking us in the right direction and that we're on the right trajectory to relieve some of these issues which have been long-standing. So, yeah, that's good news. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring in Katie Clark in a moment, but I wonder if I can just come in with a question on our remand prisoner population, maybe one for the Cabinet Secretary. The remand population comes up a lot in committee, and we know that access to support and recovery activities for the remand population is reduced compared to the convicted population, if you like. So just really interested in, at the moment, obviously, we've got a significant proportion of the population is made up of remand prisoners. So it's really just to ask for any update that can be offered with regard to how that is being managed, just in the context of what we're discussing today.
So Convener, the starting point in all of this is continuity of care and also grasping those golden opportunities when people reach a point, very often their lowest point, when there's a recognition that, there are changes that an individual must embark upon. And when people have those moments, we have to be ready to grasp them and, keep a hold of people in those times. So continuity of care is of fundamental importance. It's a key part of the Scottish Prison Service's drug and alcohol strategy. Now, it is true that there are challenges, there can be challenges for remand prisoners. However, individuals on remand have access to addictions health care in prisons. Now, that is, perhaps different, or is different from, perhaps recovery cafes and that engagement with the recovery movement. And one of actually the remarkable changes that I have seen in prisons over the past 25 years is actually the on-site presence of the voluntary sector, the recovery community, people with not just lived experience of addictions, but the criminal justice system and imprisonment, being able to access prisons to be peer mentors and engage with people. That is quite a remarkable turnaround from, a number of years ago. I should say there are some good examples where some establishments have been able to support remand prisoners' access and recovery, and that would be Stirling, Kilmarnock, and also Greenock, if my memory serves me correctly. But I do know that the prison service, they are continued to try and scope new ways of working, so that people on remand can access opportunities. It is, of course, challenging in terms of the numbers on remand and also the increase in long-term prisoners, where there are a whole range of statutory obligations, and of course the prison rules for remand prisoners is different because they're untried. So it's all caveated around people on remand may participate in education or work where the situation is different for sentenced prisoners.
Thank you for that. And I think another, just if I may, just come in back in relation to not just the remand population, but the issue of transfer of prisons. So again, we've heard in committee about the kind of impact, if you like, of what are often last-minute transfers of individuals. Now, that can be for all sorts of different reasons, but what came across from that was the kind of disruptive impact that can have on somebody who's maybe stable, who uses substances, perhaps has become quite stable and settled, and then for no reason that they're aware of, they're being transferred. Now, I know that's very much an operational requirement at the moment, but I just wondered if you had any comment on how that, on what options there may be to not eliminate that, but maybe reduce that or address that in the context of what we're discussing today.
So, I mean, I very, very much recognise the impact of transfers, particularly if they're done without much warning. That's disruptive for the individual in their care, and it's also disruptive for families as well. I'm sure you've heard evidence about that. I do think in terms of that point about person-centred care and continuity of care, I think the target operating model should help with that consistency. Again, it might not be the most politically sexy thing to talk about, but the improvements made to clinical IT are really important in terms of transfer of information and sharing of information. But the reality is right now is that because of overcrowding and the work that the prison service has to do to keep serious organised crime nominals apart from each other, to reduce the risk of violence or indeed to reduce the risk of collaboration amongst some of these individuals. And when the prisons are full, there is little scope for flexibility, and then add in with that a very vulnerable and complex population. I would also say, in terms of your point about remand prisoners, and picking up the point on through care convener, the new national through care contract has got enhanced investment to give enhanced capacity, and actually for the first time will be able to support male remand prisoners who've been released.
And certainly just going back to the point that you made about sort of clinical IT systems and clinical information, that's certainly come up in terms of that sort of timely access to clinical information where a transfer is taking place. So thank you for that. Okay, I'll bring in Katie Clark.
Thank you. And I'm wanting to ask about drugs deaths in custody in prison, because we know that we've got unacceptably high levels, no death of drug death is acceptable. One witness told us that we have not looked enough at the drivers of the increased numbers of deaths in prisons. So it would be interesting to know whether you agree with that statement, what your thoughts are in terms of what the drivers are, whether you think that the determinations of fatal accident inquiries give us some of the insights that we need, and your consideration in terms of what the drivers are. And I appreciate that you've already, Cabinet Secretary, referred to the rise in strength of the drugs that are in prisons, but I don't know who would be best to comment on that first.
I think I'll start, particularly since Ms Clark has spoken around fatal accident inquiries, and actually I think the cut and thrust of your question cuts across all drug deaths. So in terms of the need for more accountability, transparency that drives a better understanding and therefore more improvements in terms of systemic improvements around deaths in custody, actually I agree entirely. In terms of deaths in custody, last calendar year was 64, highest ever. And what the figures tell us from the year before that, 22 to 23, that for 30% of deaths in custody, it's probable suicides, 15% due to drug misuse, 21% to do with circulatory system health problems. There is, because of our older prison population, there's a high degree of natural causes. But I do caveat that with, because I think what we see in our prison population is vast health inequalities, and that shouldn't be ignored in any shape or form. I have, in my response to the fatal accident inquiry and the statement that I made to Parliament around the FAI findings on the deaths in custody with regards to William Lindsay and Katie Allen, I made a commitment to establish a national oversight mechanism, and that will enable scrutinising fatal accident inquiry determinations, and also that oversight of implementation. And I think it is accurate to say that right now there is no independent, dedicated national oversight body that is, looking at the broader framework and really scrutinising these deaths in terms of analysis, public reporting, and what the trends are as well. If I could also just add that this isn't just about FAIs and deaths in custody. I think the same could be applied to NHS significant adverse reviews and the deaths in prison learning audit and reviews that the DIPLAR. So and forgive me, Convener, talking at length, but where we are right now is that I am exploring if we can establish an independent national oversight mechanism without primary legislation. That's quite complex, and we're in the guts of that just now, and that work is still ongoing. Meantime, there is the Ministerial Advisory Board, which will meet tomorrow for the second time. I chair that again with a small panel of independent experts, and that is about that oversight of implementation of the FAI recommendations that I am committed to, and also so that there's something in place while we work on the national oversight mechanism.
So on the basis of work that you're involved in, and it's clear that there's a range of work going on involving many agencies, many individuals, and as you say, there's the recommendations that you're looking at and attempting to implement. What would you say the drivers are then from, I appreciate you're not at the end of the work, but on the basis of the work that you've done so far, what would you point to as the major drivers for the increase in particular of drugs deaths?
and drug. So I think it's quite hard to isolate that apart from the obvious in terms of the ever-increasing innovative ways of illicit supply in our prisons. The strength of these somewhat novel substances, so the work that the prison service is engaged with in terms of the Leverhulme Institute in Dundee, sometimes it can't be established what this substance actually is. The danger associated for individuals with the substances that are not just in our communities but get into our prisons requires very strong public health messaging. The impact on people's the level of danger and distress that these drugs cause on individuals is alarming. I had the privilege, I visit prisons all the time, and I had both the, if I could put it this way, both the challenge and the privilege of seeing some footage of an individual who had consumed a substance, and the degree of personal distress to that individual was a sight to behold, but then their behaviour would change very quickly from being distressed to agitated to angry. And it requires, a number of staff at any one time to care for an individual. And there is an element of the unknown in these substances, and that's why the testing that is done at Dundee University is really important. It's, you will, and Ms Todd, I'm sure, will have something to say in this as well, but these man-made synthetic substances are potent and they're dangerous, and they have upped the ante on the challenge that we face. The situation is very different from what it was, 15, 20 years ago with cannabis or heroin or opioids. It's these synthetic opioids, synthetic, benzodiazepines and drugs that actually we don't actually know what they are, that are having a catastrophic impact on individuals in our care.
And I think right at the beginning of the evidence session, that was a point that you made very, very clearly, Cabinet Secretary. And of course, Liam Kerr also raised the issue of overcrowding, because the evidence that we've heard is the boredom that people face, the lack of meaningful activity seems to be another driver that drives people perhaps to drugs. We've heard evidence that toxicology results in drugs deaths generally can take to up to 18 months, which can delay learning. So is that something that you're looking at? Is that an accurate reflection?
I can certainly check what our recent data shows. We are able to get access to some toxicology almost instantaneously. So if I've spoken before in Chamber about the incident we faced in March, where a batch of opiates contaminated with synthetic opiates came into Scotland, and we very quickly began to see overdose incidents in our community, including in the Thistle in Glasgow, because those people were using in a supervised drug consumption facility. They were able to be resuscitated, and they provided samples of the drugs that they had been using, which were very quickly analysed, and very quickly detailed information went out using the Public Health Scotland radar system to ensure that every part of Scotland was aware of the risks from synthetic opioids. So there are some, I think drug testing, we're able to access information quite quickly. There may be challenges, and I think I've heard there may be specific challenges around post-mortem toxicology, which is slightly different. There are challenges often in identifying these nitazines are incredibly potent, so they're in very small quantities in people's bloodstreams. So detecting them, because the detection threshold needs to be very, very low, is difficult. There are also challenges in that the ever-evolving synthetic market means that there are more nitocines appearing each time we develop a test for them. I mean, I think if I could, and I think Richard has something to say specifically on the toxicology, if I could go back to your point around the increase in drugs deaths in prison. I mean, I think you've had other witnesses at this inquiry who have said that the use of drugs in prisons often mirrors what's happening in community, and what we're seeing in community is a really significant threat from the rise in synthetics. We have recently, in recent years, so in the last 5 years, while the mission has been occurring, so initially we were very much up against opiates. But quite quickly, synthetic benzodiazepines came onto the market, caused challenges, contributed to deaths. We've also had a rise in synthetic cannabinoids, which are significantly more potent and cause harm and can cause sudden death. And now we've got these exceptionally potent synthetic opioids, the nitocines, which were developed about 60 years ago, but were never able to be used safely because they're such an incredible overdose risk, and they're causing real challenges for us. And I think the thing to understand is that they cause challenges in how we disrupt supply as well. So it's not just that they have different effects on our bodies when they're taken, but as one paramedic said to me when they were training me in naloxone use, the potency is such that what used to fit into a suitcase now fits into a matchbox. And that means that the traditional way in which we disrupted supply is different. A different approach is needed, and that's the case in our prisons as well as in community. In terms of how we deal with that, I mean, we have got a naloxone programme within prisons, so there are challenges with benzodiazepine overdoses. There isn't a straightforward antidote that can be used outside of a clinical setting, although that is being investigated and trialled at the moment. Edinburgh University are doing research into that. There are certainly challenges with the impact of taking synthetic cannabinoids and the effects that has on your body, reversing those. But when it comes to opiates, we do have an antidote that can be used, and we have ensured that that is available throughout the prison service, and it is being used at times within prison. So prison officers are trained in naloxone administration, and we have ensured that that is available, but that only gives us a solution to one drug. You'll also have heard with all the alerts that have been in the public domain over the last few months, nitocines are so potent and so dangerous that people are needing repeated doses of naloxone. So anyone who is administering naloxone is having to administer quite a lot more of it for quite a lot longer than they would with conventional opiates. So it's as I keep saying in my role, we need to be agile. We need to recognise that things change, and we need to respond to those changes. And it's exactly the same in the prison system as it is in the community system.
I just had one very conscious of the committee's time. So just in case of the question of consistency of practice around the NHS side, of course, there's many reasons why a formal determination through toxicology could take some time, but we can't wait, need to be agile. So I wonder if it would be helpful to the committee. We can share with you the toolkit that NHS teams have to ensure both the network, in addition to radar, so that the NHS teams and clinical teams are ready to respond, because sometimes these things can happen not just in one establishment. So there is a toolkit for NHS teams deployed across all the clinical teams in prisons that is about sharing practice and how to respond quickly, separate from the toxicology results. So if it would be helpful to the committee, happy to send you that toolkit so you can consider whether it's adequate and it covers your questions.
That would be extremely helpful. And also, if you are able to provide any more information about any delays that could be addressed, then that would be of interest to the committee.
Okay, thank you, Katie. I'm going to bring in Fulton McGregor, and then I'll bring in Sharon Dowie.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary, Minister and officials. My apologies that I'm not there in a physical forum, and I'm here in remote forum. I've found this a very useful session so far, with both Cabinet Secretary and Minister bringing in quite vast experience into some of the answers as well. It's particularly taken on with the exchange between the Minister and Rona Mackay about you know, the drugs that we'd heard about last week and the impact that they can have. My questions are more going to relate probably for yourself, Cabinet Secretary, and more related to the community and perhaps the opportunities there. And that's when offenders particularly come to us perhaps for the first time, or if it's not the first time, if it's a repeat occasion, but they're coming to services presenting with alcohol problems. And I'm specifically homing in on alcohol problems in this occasion, and that being the main issue in terms of their offending. Do you think there's opportunities there when somebody presents like that we could be doing more to support them at that point to avoid further offending? Thanks.
The short answer is, Convener, yes. And one of the things that I've been actively engaged with over the past few years is to ensure that statutory criminal justice social work is on a firmer footing, and actually social work more broadly. So there have been new measures taken, for example, around bursaries and graduate apprenticeships to ensure that we have the workforce supply going into training. And that's very important because there are particular demands on social work as a profession and concerns about retention, particularly of newly qualified social workers. So that's obviously in terms of statutory social work services, and Mr McGregor will be aware that over the past 2 financial years we've increased investment in community justice to by £25 million, so that it's £159 million, and I'm determined that we need to continue to invest and grow community justice services overall. Because we know that community interventions are more effective in comparison to short-term custodial sentences. I do also want to point to the importance of the voluntary sector in all of this, and this is where, and this is a cross-government commitment, and I would also say it should be, cross governments, both local and national, in terms of, supporting and utilising where we can the potential of the voluntary sector. And so obviously the national mission funding and support that goes to alcohol and drug partnerships and to other grassroots organisations creates really good opportunities for partnership working with voluntary and statutory agencies and places for referral. The other point to be made around all of this is, I suppose, in and around voluntary aftercare is as well. But I'll just leave my remarks there just now, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Fulton McGregor, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, thanks, Cabinet Secretary. Actually, the answer you gave there leads me on to my next line of questioning, because as you've articulated there, there's often quite a lot of different services and agencies involved with people when they present with issues perhaps relating to alcohol, and they can be statutory as well as third sector and various others. Do you think there's maybe a case for more of a oversight and an accountability system, that could be looked at in these situations, so that perhaps there's, I'm not saying, I've worked in the field as well, like yourself, Cabinet Secretary, and I'm not saying that work that's going on doesn't have that oversight, but there can be aspects of people are just doing their own thing. If they're a health service, if they're a charitable organisation, if they're a social work organisation, is there a case maybe for more of an oversight in relation to that, do you think?
Well, I would certainly hope that the new National Social Work Agency would help in this regard, as you know, will other measures. And also, I failed to mention, and to Mr McGregor's earlier question, the importance of the work that Ms Somerville has taken forward in terms of the fairer funding pilot, and that is around multi-year funding for the voluntary sector. I think my own view in this, Mr McGregor, and it's quite a personal one, is that accountability should be seen as a positive and not something that we should be fighting against or be defensive about. And you raised the point there about many services being involved with an individual, potentially. And that's very positive, but what we always have to guard against is people being passed from pillar to post. And that's where there needs to be, you know, clear lines of accountability and responsibility. And in terms of the work that Ms Todd and I are involved in, we can see that work taking place in that kind of strategic justice and healthcare work that is being pursued in quite detail, because from the national leadership group, which is where senior officials from Justice and Health are getting on with the nitty-gritty, and obviously the oversight comes from ministers of that work. I mean, I don't know if that's quite a general response to a question that's quite general. I don't know if Mr McGregor had. I'm just conscious. I just want to check that I'm not missing the point that he's raising, if it's something specific about accountability.
No, I think that's fine, Cabinet Secretary. I'm happy with that response. Convener, I've just got one further question, if that's all right.
I wonder if I can just bring in the Minister just to respond, and then I'll bring you back in, Fulton McGregor.
Yeah, just to put on record, which I think is probably useful, that we're Scottish Government's developing a national service specification for drug and alcohol treatment in Scotland, alongside guidance informed by the UK-wide clinical guidance for alcohol treatment, and that will aim to provide clarity on the types of treatment that should be available, and that national specification will set out the types of treatment, the types of recovery service that should be available all across Scotland, as well as providing impetus for improved joint working between the public sector, third sector partners, and everyone who needs to collaborate in order to improve outcomes for the individuals who are affected. That will apply in the custody and prisons, as well as in our hospitals and primary care.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Minister. Back to you, Fulton McGregor.
Thanks both Cabinet Secretary and to the Minister. Just one final question, probably for the Cabinet Secretary again. It's relating to some of the evidence that we heard from the prisons previously, that they are more or less saying, I'm maybe not quoting this exactly here, but more or less saying that alcohol is no longer a major issue within the prison estates. Occasionally there might be some hooch around about Christmas time, I think was almost a direct quote from one of the witnesses, but in general it's not an issue, and it has been overtaken by drugs and synthetics particularly, which has already been outlined today. I'm just wondering, Cabinet Secretary, is this what the government are interpreting as well, that alcohol is no longer the issue within prisons that it used to be, and how is that affecting or impacting policy decisions around drug and alcohol use within prisons?
So, in terms of the illicit supply of substances, that's quite correct. It's less about hooch, as Mr McGregor says, and much more about very dangerous synthetic opioids that is making its way into our prisons and having an impact on the prison population similar to that in the community. Nonetheless, alcohol remains a feature in offending behaviour. So you will have people on admission to prisons who are poorly because they're not getting access to alcohol, and there may be issues to do with withdrawals, and who will need care and treatment. And if it's a factor in someone's offending behaviour, they nonetheless, will benefit from access to the recovery community or other rehabilitative type opportunities in and around their offending behaviour. So it's not that it's not an issue, because if it's been an issue for an individual in the community, it is therefore an issue and a risk that needs to be addressed whilst in custody, and needs to be a feature in any release planning for an individual. You might see that in and around conditions that the parole board set, or in the more detailed through care planning that takes place for individuals. I just wondered, is there anything that Ms Todd wants to add?
No, I think I would just emphasise exactly the same. Alcohol is definitely a feature in offending behaviour. The need for medical detoxification on admission to custody may well be there in many of the people coming into custody, and I suppose it illustrates very clearly that abstinence is not recovery. So whilst people are in prison, they may well not be able to access alcohol, but that doesn't mean the problem has gone away, and it certainly needs to be dealt with during their time in custody, and needs to be anticipated as a problem on release from custody. We've got some, as I said, we have some good work going on with recovery communities in reaching into prison. I think there's long established routes in for organisations like Alcoholics Anonymous come into prisons and do work in their peer support work, which then can continue into the outside. We've got some good work going on in prison to rehab as well, which would cover alcohol as well as drugs. So it certainly is an important factor. And similarly with other drugs, so, alcohol is simply a drug. If people are abstinent for a period of time, on liberation, the risks of consuming and overdose are high, so that risk needs to be acknowledged and planned for as well, that they may have, during their stay in prison, reduced their tolerance to alcohol and may not be able to consume the levels of alcohol that they were in advance of admission to the prison estate, and might face some enhanced risks on liberation that they are not aware of.
Thanks to both for those answers. I would also say that I strongly agree with the sentiments shared there, and a good opportunity for that to be put on the record. That's me, convener. Thank you.
I think Rona Mackay wants to. Is it on this line of questioning? Okay, I'll bring in Sharon Dowie and then I'll come back to yourself. I am aware that we're just coming up to time, but if the panel, just to give everybody a chance to come in with their questions, so if the panel is willing to bear with us, we'll maybe just stretch another 5, maybe 10 minutes or so. Thank you very much. Okay, Sharon Dowie.
Thank you. Good morning. The committee's heard from various witnesses that vapes are a prominent issue regarding how prisoners can ingest substances. The Prison Officers Association also mentioned in submission to the committee that staff feel as though the prison estate, by allowing the use of vapes, is providing prisoners with the tools to misuse substances. So has there been any constructive discussions between the Scottish Government and SPS regarding the issues associated with vapes and how it can be addressed? Do you believe the policy on vape usage in the prison estate needs to change, and if so, what changes need to be made?
So I've seen that evidence, and it will certainly be an issue that I'll discuss further with the Scottish Prison Service. As you'd appreciate, I engage very regularly with the Chief Executive and other senior staff, so just to acknowledge that I've seen that. Ms Todd's a bit more of an expert on the vapes in the real world than I am.
Yeah, I mean, I think I answered a question in Parliament recently around the selling of vapes to children over social media that are contain synthetic cannabinoids. So there's undoubtedly a market out there where vapes are containing drugs other than nicotine. I guess in harm reduction terms, vaping nicotine is less harmful than smoking nicotine, and that is, I would imagine, why there is a difficulty in assessing how nicotine substitution should be available within prisons, and how to reduce the risk of access to drugs that are unintended as well as the nicotine.
So, are the SPS looking at the policy just now for vapes
So
in
I'll
the
just say
prisons?
to you, Ms Dowie, that I will discuss the matter further with SPS.
Right, okay. The other thing that was raised was what has been done to protect staff from vape smoke, and obviously illegal fumes which they're exposed to when they're obviously vaping illicit substances. Yeah. There was concerns about adequate provision of PPE for prison officers when they were required to enter prison cells after substances have been used in smoke, used or smoked. So it was final question, how is the government working with the NHS and SPS to ensure the health and welfare of all staff is safeguarded?
So in general terms, the health and welfare of prison staff is a matter that I do indeed discuss with the Chief Executive of the Prison Service. It's a matter she raises with me. It is a factor in the issues in and around overcrowding in terms of staff resilience, for example. The issue the specific issue you relate to is, of course, a purely operational matter. But I do know that there are very specific guidance and procedures in terms of staff when they have to have contact with a prisoner where there are fumes involved, where there are illicit drugs involved, because some of the issues with these novel substances is it can be absorbed in the skin. So there are procedures about when to engage in these circumstances, and there are procedures around how that should be approached and the equipment required. But I can, of course, ask the Prison Service to supply both me and the committee with a more detailed account of the specific procedures that are in place. But it's an important point that speaks to the changing and increasing challenge associated with drugs. This isn't just about people ingesting something into their body that, of course, has an impact on their behaviour. It is the ingestion of substances that has a direct bearing on the health and well-being of prison officers. And I've certainly had constituency cases raised with me around the impact on prison staff and on their health of being in close proximity to fumes, etc.
Okay. I can certainly look into it. At the CPG last week, the issue of risks of passive inhalation was raised, and I made a note then to go back and see what evidence we have around that particular issue, and I can see if there is, from a health perspective, any elucidation of the risks around passive inhalation of these substances.
No, that would be good if we could get more information on PPE that's available. If there's any barriers, if there's any cost implications, just to make sure they get the PPE that they need. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Rhona Mackay.
And I will be brief. It's just to pick up on a point that the Cabinet Secretary made in her opening statement, and it's about staff training. Prison officers have got a huge responsibility when people come into the prison, people who are already possibly addicted to substances. And I know this is an operational matter, but we know that the training for prison officers in the UK generally is lower than a lot of other countries, much lower. I think it's around 6 weeks or something. I know the training is ongoing as they're in the job, but I'm just wondering if your view, Cabinet Secretary, on whether you think the training, given the sort of dangerous even more dangerous environment that prison staff are working in, is the training sufficient for them to cope?
So, I mean, this is, you know, an operational matter. I'm not sure you necessarily want a politician or a former social worker talking in detail about the exact and precise training that should be given to prison officers. That said, I have visited the SPS College and had the pleasure of meeting new recruits on more than one occasion. And what I observe is they are certainly recruiting a greater diversity of people to work in their prison service. And by that I mean from different backgrounds. So as you would, you know, anticipate, prison service quite often attracts people who've worked in the military. But there is also, I observed, a growing number of people who've worked in care sectors or with children. And I think that blend is quite important. I mean, the old terminology is, and this is very outdated language, I do apologise, that, you know, for criminal justice social work, for prison service, that it's about care and control. These are controlling institutions, but it's also about the care, so they need to be safe, secure. Prison officers need to be able to respond to violence, they need to be able to prevent violence, but they also need to be able to respond to violence. And I've also seen some mock operations in terms of how particular prison officers are trained to deal with disruption. The Scottish Prison Service have a facility, actually my constituent by chance, in Fauldhouse, where they do more operational and tactical training. And that's part of the ongoing training and development of officers who will be given specialist training, because of there will be, for some officers, specialist roles they will carry that, should that be required within the prison they work at, or indeed in another prison. They are certainly always evolving the training that takes place. So if I could point to control and restraint, for example, the Scottish Prison Service has developed pain-free control and restraint, and that came through their work and concern for young people. And that work, that training has attracted a lot of attention internationally. So it is a matter that is kept under review. I'm very cognizant of the demands on prison service staff, and the strains and stresses is probably putting it mildly. And we have to have an acuity about ensuring that we can retain experienced staff, because that mix between old and new is really important. And it is also the case, and I don't imagine this will surprise colleagues, but the number of prison officers has increased. There is often much talk about the public sector workforce, but this, rightly so, is a workforce that has increased from 3,462, and that was in 23-24, and today's number of prison officers is 3,797.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Convener.
We just finished the session with a question regarding stigma. The Minister spoke earlier on about the national mission, and obviously within that there's been a lot of work done with regard to the National Collaborative, the Charter of Rights for people affected by substance use. And during our evidence sessions, we've heard about the issue of stigma, and you know that's certainly something that's come up in the context of stigma in the prison environment, and sort of stigma and sort of judgment, if you like, by prison officers and staff. So we know that happens, and that there is a lot of work, obviously, ongoing to address that. So I'm just interested in maybe asking the Minister just maybe for an update with regard to the work around the Charter of Rights. And I know that's something that was featured heavily during the recent Scottish Drugs Forum National Conference. And I think just to kind of add into that some evidence that we've taken from family members who have also raised concerns about the lack of accessible information, both for them and their loved ones in prison. So that, again, that issue around rights and us, I suppose, respecting rights. So just really interested in what update the Minister can provide on that.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's very clear. I mean, stigma is... it prevents people from accessing the treatment that they need. It prevents them from asking for help. It prevents them from getting the help they are not only need but have a right to. So it's a really serious and cross-cutting issue right across the work of the National Mission. I mean, I think there is work going on. Certainly since I've come into this role, I recognise the work on stigma probably does need to be at a population level, but we probably do need to start with certain communities. So that I hear about, I hear very clearly from the work and the analysis that's being done amongst the community, people who are affected by substance use, that health professional stigma is a significant challenge that they face, and I'm very reflective about what specific actions we can take to try to reduce that. I think the Charter is really powerful, important work. I think a lot of upholding rights starts with people knowing that they have rights, and are able to articulate that when they're asking for help and support. I think that will absolutely, and working with people with lived and living experience, is how we will close the implementation gap, which is the torment of most ministers, government ministers' lives, that we have great and lofty ambitions and ideas, and what we see is absolutely outstanding, largely. What happens on the ground and at the coalface doesn't always reflect the ambition. So involving people with lived and living experience will help us to get that right in the first place, get our policy right, get our legislation right, get our frameworks right, and then hold our feet to the fire on delivery. I mean, I guess I'm very thoughtful around the issue of stigma, and I think it's probably an opportunity to put a challenge to the committee around how institutional stigma can be and how systematic stigma can be. So if we go back to that early exchange that we had, Rona, around the availability of Buvidal on discharge from prison, and I have heard that raised before. And my immediate thought as a health professional and as a minister in this government is, why would somebody's medication be changed on discharge for bureaucratic and administrative reasons and not clinical reasons? I am not confident that that would happen if we were talking about an antihypertensive drug or an asthma drug, rather than a drug that is used to maintain someone's stability and a well-recognised, well-evidenced treatment for drug dependence. And I think it's really important that we reflect on that. So I think that there are all sorts of things that happen to people who have substance use challenges that would not happen to the rest of the population, and it's worth us really considering and reflecting on that. There's a double stigma for people who have been in the justice system. So I think it's really important that we think about, and as the Cabinet Secretary said, our citizens have a right to access the same quality of healthcare wherever it is they are living in Scotland, whether they are in custody or whether they are in community.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Thank you. I realise we've slightly overrun, so I'm going to bring the session to a close. Thank you all very, very much indeed. That's been a really informative session this morning. And we'll have a suspension for 5 minutes, just to allow the Minister and our officials to leave. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, members. So our next item of business is consideration of the Scottish Government's consultation on a super-affirmative instrument which will add sex to the list of protected characteristics for the offences outlined in the Hate Crime and Public Order Act. So just for clarification, we are not approving the SSI today. This is an opportunity to ask the Cabinet Secretary some initial questions, and if I can refer members to paper 3. So, can I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement outlining her plans for this consultation, and then we'll move to questions. Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks, Convener. As the committee is aware, the Scottish Government intended to legislate for a misogyny bill in this Parliament. However, I announced on the 2nd of May that due to the complexity of this area of law and the clear and unambiguous provisions that would be needed, which would include the policy implications of the Supreme Court judgment of the 16th of April, there would be insufficient time for a bill to be finalised and introduced. This was also exacerbated by the short time left in this parliamentary session, along with a very packed legislative timetable. I was also clear that I did not want a gap in criminal law protections for women and girls, so I would bring forward an SSI to add the characteristic of sex to the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act 2021. This SSI, as you've said, Convener, is subject to a super-affirmative procedure which allows for thorough scrutiny before any legislation is finalised, and therefore the required consultation seeks views on the draft policy of the SSI. We will, of course, carefully consider all feedback and views, including those of this committee, and that will inform the final SSI to be laid in Parliament. The changes being consulted on would ensure the criminal law protections for women and girls will be the same as those provided through the Hate Crime Act for other characteristics such as age, race and disability. As the characteristic of sex is added, men and boys will also be protected. However, we know that women and girls suffer significantly more from threats, abuse and harassment based on their sex, so are likely to benefit most from these new protections and be able to report matters to the police. This legislation will make it an offence for a person to stir up hatred against women and girls, and where an offender is motivated by or demonstrates malice or ill will towards women and girls in committing a criminal offence. That offence will be aggravated by prejudice relating to the characteristics of sex. I consider these measures being consulted upon to represent a significant step forward in strengthening legal protections for women and girls, ensuring our justice system can respond appropriately to hate crimes motivated by prejudice on the basis of sex, ahead of a misogyny bill a future government could introduce. Happy to take questions, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Cabinet Secretary. So I wonder if I can maybe just start off, and then I'll just ask members to indicate if they wish to come in. Obviously, we know that the consultation is underway, and I think I'm right in saying it closes around the 10th of October. So can I maybe just ask the Cabinet Secretary for a wee bit more detail on the consultation process, specifically who all by way of stakeholders are being consulted?
Sure, of course, and obviously it's welcome, for anyone with an interest to respond to the consultation. So the consultation launched on the 28th of August, the same day that the draft SSI was published. On the Citizen Space Scottish Government website, there is obviously the SSI and text to explain the small number of policy choices that have been made, and my officials proactively sent this information to bodies on the Hate Crime Partnership Group, but also to those who had responded to the consultation on the misogyny bill.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'm just going to open it up to colleagues, and I'm going to bring in Liam Kerr and then Katie Clark.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning again, Cabinet Secretary. I recall being very critical of the government at the time of the hate crime bill for leaving sex out at the time. But even then, I argued that there was a need for something more to be considered. And it seems that the working group has sympathy with that approach. Cabinet Secretary, what's lost, in your view, by using this mechanism rather than a standalone bill? And does the Scottish Government have any plans to revisit the issue of a misogyny bill in the future?
So, I certainly appreciate that question, Mr Kerr. The view that I've come to, and I'm not going to rehearse what arguments were made around the time of the passage of the hate crime legislation. For me, I was not prepared to leave a gap in the law, a gap in existing hate crime legislation with respect to women. That doesn't mean that a future government, won't take forward a misogyny bill. But in terms of right here, right now, I have come to the conclusion, if I can just put it very bluntly, that I'm not having a gap in the law in relation to women. And that's my straightforward view on that. There was, of course, a power left to address that issue very deliberately in the Hate Crime Act. It fits well, so the opportunity in terms of the definition of sex, it fits well with the hate crime framework, in that it certainly minimises any overlap with other characteristics. I mean, there is always the potential for overlap with other characteristics, but it just felt to me that a gap that at the end of the day wasn't justifiable, and I wanted to address it before the end of this parliamentary session. It is fair to say that a misogyny bill, and where misogyny legislation differs from hate crime legislation, is misogyny legislation is specifically gendered legislation, and it is a more nuanced approach. My view of the work that Baroness Kennedy led was that it was excellent work in laying out, if anybody was ever in any doubt, the extent of misogyny and harassment that women face in this country. But this is complex legislation. I wish it was not thus, but it is complex legislation. And when there are 16 Scottish Government bills still to come to their conclusion before murder, and 15 members' bills, there is a practical reality that is of course regretful. But I don't think Baroness Kennedy's work in this area is lost. But there's an opportunity for us to strengthen the law, in my view, with this SSI, and it's important we do it, because I repeat, I'm not having a gap in the law for women.
Yeah, personally, I welcome that approach. A thought just does occur, though, because the working group reported, I think, in 2022, and the government's response was from April 2022. What has been done in that gap between then and now that hopefully will allow a future government to pick up and run with that ball on a future misogyny bill?
So there has been extensive work in this, extensive policy development work. I will ask Mr Lamont in a minute to comment on that and give people a feel of the size and scope of the work that has been undertaken. The issue, as I said, is complex, and with any misogyny bill, it needs to, and because it's criminal law, it needs to have clear and unambiguous provisions, and that's been central to considerations within government. And it does have to include policy implications of the recent Supreme Court judgment. So obviously, at one point in time, we were waiting on the Supreme Court judgment. We now have that, which means, further work is required. And it's accurate for me to say that, there were some matters that the Baroness Kennedy's working group that she left to legislators, and that's where we've been. And I'm not saying she was wrong to do that. I think it's entirely fair and credible. But there were matters that were left to legislators to address in and around a misogyny bill, and we have not concluded that policy work. Philip, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, just briefly, the main thing that the government did outward facing was to develop draft provisions based on Baroness Kennedy's report, so that's what's changed since 2022. So in terms of your question, Mr Kerr, about how could it be picked up, well, there are draft provisions, but they need to be finalised and refined, but that's the progress that's been made, so it's not just the policy blueprint, there's actually draft provisions in the public domain.
That's very helpful, thank you. One final question from me then. What does the government project will be the impact on prosecutions from making this change, and how will resource be scaled as a result?
So, coming to a precise figure on impact, while we have an informed view of that, giving you a precise figure. So, based on other jurisdictions where there are similar laws in a range of hate crime legislation, or a range of hate crime provisions, we would expect around 5 to 10%. As I said, it's very rough, but a 5 to 10% of cases being attributed to, malice, ill will, harassment of women based on their sex. But as I said, that's rough. Much of the pain around resource in terms of hate crime legislation has already been resolved. The one area where we continue to engage with is with Police Scotland around the work that they'll need to do to upgrade and update their training guidance.
Very grateful. Convener.
Thank you. Kitty Clark and then Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you, and I agree that there shouldn't be a gap in hate crime legislation, so it's quite right that the Scottish Government are coming forward with proposals. And if we leave aside all the debates around the misogyny bill for now, and I appreciate that may well be something we're going to come back to in the new offences that are being proposed, and it perhaps is a different and additional approach to these proposals. Engenda think that the hate crime model was not designed to address the nature and scale of violence and discrimination against women, and the working group said that it would be very difficult to prove a specific act is based on sex. So does the Cabinet Secretary agree with those points? And if so, how has that been taken into account in the thinking in the drafting of this SSI? Has there been consideration as to whether it's simply a matter of slotting the word sex in, which is what seems to be within the SSI, or whether it needed to be addressed in a different way with further redrafting? Is that something that she grappled with or had discussions with officials about? So
in short, yes. But the hate crime legislative framework is it's a proven model for providing legal protections, and while there may be a range of views on the approach we're taking, or indeed a range of views around not being able to progress with misogyny bill, I mean, I am taking some comfort that there's a recognition that there's a gap in our hate crime legislation, and it needs to be addressed. It, of course, is never as simple as just slotting things in. And Philip, would you like to speak to that? since you've done the slotting in?
To a certain extent, it's driven by the enabling power of the in the Act. So therefore, there's not much flexibility for the government to do anything other than add the characteristic of sex and certain other minor matters such as deciding whether the protection for freedom of expression in the Act applies, etc. But there isn't much beyond that can be done. I'm sure the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee would have words with us if we sought to do that. So this is the framework we have. And as the Cabinet Secretary said, it will close the gap that exists in hate crime law in terms of women and girls.
Okay, I think that's helpful. So there really isn't very much flexibility round about that, given the way that the original legislation was drafted. So perhaps something that you have given consideration to, therefore, given some of these complexities, is how that's going to be addressed in the training of the police and the other agencies that are going to be looking at how we implement this additional provision, given that we know how difficult these issues can be. And is that something that there's been discussion about, Cabinet Secretary?
Yeah, and I mean, of course, you know, these are serious, important, sensitive, you know, that there are, you know, matters that aren't without their complexity. But I think given the journey that we have travelled with hate crime and its implementation, I am not anticipating any knotty issues to resolve, but I mean we will continue to engage with Police Scotland, for example, and you know I've also got a series of engagements with you know other parties, some of whom you've mentioned today, who understandably are disappointed that the misogyny bill is not proceeding at this time.
No, I understand. And is there likely to be any further guidance, anything additional that's likely to be provided in terms of implementation?
I mean, in terms of any statutory guidance, the Act doesn't allow for the government to issue statutory guidance, but I'm sure in the same way that happened with the Hate Crime Act, there will be information about what this means for people and they can understand their new protections. So that will definitely be part of the implementation.
And I think that speaks to I suppose the broader issue that legislation alone doesn't always change people's behaviour or rectify the experiences that women have in our communities. So and we've just had a session in and around a completely different matter that touched upon people need to know their rights to exercise their rights.
Okay. Thank you.
Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you. My questions relate more to the context in which we should consider this order, because clearly it's at draft stage and we'll come to the specifics in due course. And we found at least one person who can testify to the point I've made, because Mr Kerr said that at the time of the passage of the bill he thought that this should have been in the face of the bill and in primary legislation. So I suppose the first observation, or indeed a question, would be, and I recall others, you know, some constituents in touch with at the time suggesting similar. Should we be bearing that in mind? You know, that as part of the context. Yes, we took an approach that said we could do this by second legislation, but there actually was a cohort at the time of the passage of the bill that said we should do this, and also more widely and very clearly understand the point that you've made around the misogyny bill, but Parliament having legislated for this provision to enable the government to bring forward an order. Do you also think it's important that we must consider this order on its own merits, irrespective of whether or not there is a misogyny bill coming forward? This order should be considered on its own merits as well.
Yes. I do, but that, you know, I'm conscious that no issue operates in a vacuum, and that there are many of our stakeholders who campaigned for misogyny legislation, but I do believe that filling the gap in the hate crime legislation is a step forward. This is new protections for women and girls. It may, you know, have a bearing on any future work. You know, it may, and I just say may, you know, reduce maybe the size and scope of a misogyny bill, potentially. But, we operate in an environment that we operate in. I'm, highly sensitive to the range of views on this matter, and that there were many of our stakeholders and partners, who fought very hard for a misogyny bill, and I understand their disappointment in that. But as Mr Lamont said, the scope for the SSI, in terms of what the legislation allows us to do, is quite specified, and I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to do that.
And of course, going back to your, but I can certainly testify, having been involved in looking at the legislative agenda of late, the challenges around trying to take things forward, or additional things forward in primary legislation between now and the end of this session. So clearly that not being a possibility, referring back to a potential misogyny bill, you have referred to filling the gap. I just wondered if we could, and again we'll probably get into this more when we actually consider the order in more detail down the line, but can you maybe speak a little bit more to what that means in practical terms, in terms of filling the gap? And what are the types of incident and their prevalence, which may be difficult to answer, I understand, in relation to those that are not captured by the law as it stands?
So, right now we have hate crime legislation that offers protections to people, rightly so, on the basis of age, disability, religion, race, transgender identity, and so forth. And they have protections with regards to stirring up hatred offences, which is where there is threatening or abusive behaviour or communication that is essentially targeted at people because of their protected, characteristic, whether that's sex, race, disability, and also in terms of aggravated offences. So in terms of the adding in the aggravated, or scope to convict on offences aggravated by malice and ill will, that's really important because there's already an offence being committed. And if that offence, has been motivated by hatred towards women and girls, that should rightly be recorded and taken into account, for example, in sentencing, and it's as a salient matter for the court to consider.
Thank you.
Very much. I wonder if I can maybe just finish off with, unless there are any other members wish to come in, just with more a practical question with regard to the sort of future timetable, beyond the closure of the consultation period. So I suppose just to ask if the views will be published, or the responses to the consultation rather will be published online, and will there be an opportunity for the committee to be perhaps provided with an update on potential changes or alterations after the consultation?
So in terms of that point of process, convener, the consultation will end the 10th of October, and then what will happen is that the responses will be published, provided respondents have given their permission. There will need to be an analysis of the information that we've received, and there'll have to be a form of statistical analysis, as there always is with these consultations. We will, of course, then, in due course, write to committee if there is any changes to the final SSI or not. And I would want to lay this SSI before Christmas so that it can be addressed early 2026, and certainly I'm hoping before February recess. That's what I'm aiming for.
Thank you very much indeed. So if there's no other questions, thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary and your officials. That brings the public part of our meeting to a close. Next week we'll hear from the Cabinet Secretary again on a package of legislative consent memos for the UK Crime and Policing Bill. So thank you again, and we now move into private session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.